Well, now let us move on to a different conversation, and this one is one that borders on extreme use of knowledge, and also where do you draw the line when it comes to ethical and moral use of genetics in determining where the strong point of somebody's athletic capabilities are. And there is a research article that is titled Genetic Differentiation in East African Ethnicities and its Relationship with Endurance Running Success. And there were two Kenyans who were involved in the project. It's all about anthropology and how it works with science and genetics and sport. And we have got the Director of Research and Innovation at the Maseno University, who's also a professor of genetics and medical sciences, Professor Collins Wahome. And Professor, good morning to you out in Maseno.
Good morning to you. We are good at Maseno University.
All right. And joining us from Eldoret is a biomedical scientist, and he was the lead in the Breaking 2 attempt and later the Ineos 159, Gerald Luande, who's based in Eldoret. Good morning to you, Gerald.
Good morning, Wahome.
And Mr. Professor, and Professor, you could tell us what drove you to get in this study. You decided to look at athletes from Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Jamaica, and the fields where they succeed in athletics, long distance.
Thank you, Wahome. So, if you already notice, you realize that a lot of this competition since 1960s has been dominated a lot by East Africa, especially the Kalenjin of Kenya and the of Ethiopia. And there has been a lot of speculations of relevance of the Kenyan athletes in this process. And people have always speculated that if you have a favorable diet, you are living and training at high altitude, the motivation to get rid of poverty, which is more or less economic motivation, and the habit of running to school as children as being factors that control this. But then you look at the population that you mentioned, you realize that majority of those do not actually become successful when they compete. Now, having said that, you look at the factors that I've just mentioned, none of these factors alone can explain such success, as they are also present in other countries and they're present in other populations as well, populations that have not produced successful athletes in that matter. So what we were thinking was that there could be to favor that endurance running success that we are seeing in those particular populations. And then at the tail end of it, beyond the environment, we're thinking that there could be some inborn component within those particular populations that we count in this process. And that's why we specifically picked those two particular populations and looked at controls that we were already having data from and which we could potentially link now genetic level and see variations in what we were seeing in the control populations. We surveyed the population that are successful in this process. As you also know, the extent to which champions are born is a question that remains one of considerable interest, since it has implications for talent and management, as well as for how sporting federations, like the one we have in Kenya, like the KFF, allocate scarce resources towards the optimization of high performance programs. So we thought that, look, this other genetic component in this particular population and control the other variables, then potentially we could pick up certain issues that we could also potentially use in later later processes of making decisions when we are doing research for sporting federations. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Uma. And let me come to you, Gerald. And when it came, to picking up this, because you worked a lot with athletes in Eldoret, working together in the Breaking the Project, the INEOS 159 project. What was your experience, trying to get this data and understand how it works from the biomedical side of it?
So thank you very much, Wahome. It's true, I've worked with athletes for a long time. This study was relatively different from what we've done before, because in this particular study, we didn't meet any athlete. What we did is, over the years since the Human Genome Project, there have been data sets and databases developed for these genes, for different relations. So a similar one for the African region is called the Africa Genome Variation Project. So our study literally anchored on the African Genome Variation Project by going to the database, looking at specific traits that make somebody a marathoner. For instance, what makes them endure hostile environments, their lung capacity, their waist to hip ratio, their bone density, bone mineral density, and many other variables, like even risk of heart attack. So this is what we targeted in this study, as opposed to other studies where you literally go talk to an athlete.
And Gerald, let me just come to you. And from your experience, especially with the long distance runners, what were the things that you found out about, number one, their lung capacity, their bone density, and the interesting thing is the hip and waist ratio? How does that work?
Okay. So ideally, endurance athletes, because of the nature of training and their upbringing, they evolve over time. So you'll find, for instance, they have a very low heart rate. So if they walk into a clinic and get their heart rate checked, somebody might think they need to be admitted instantly. Unfortunately, they don't need to be admitted, because that is them. It gives them the ability to stay long over almost 2 hours, 3 hours of training. Because if at all they would get their heart rate elevated so fast, they will get fatigued so fast and drop out of the race. So naturally, this is one of the so you need to have such a lean body so that you waste limited bodies during. So the
get together too close across the curves are a bit narrow. An ideal would be to have
Okay. Okay. All right. So Gerald one day speaking to us, telling us about, some of the basic things that they were trying to look for when they were doing this study about genetics and sports and how they and how they affect where somebody goes. Are you going to be an endurance runner or a sprinter? And also we are with the Director of Research and Innovation at Maseno University, Professor Collins Ouma. Now, Professor and Gerald, we'll be taking a short break. And when we come back, you will be telling us about the findings from this study and their implications in making decisions and growing the sport in Kenya, in Ethiopia, and also, say, in Nigeria, plus some of the ethical questions that may come from this study. Let's take a short break. And welcome back to Sports Check. On this Monday morning, it is the 30th day of May 2022. My name is Daniel Wahome, and it is a day when out in Rabai, in Kilifi County, there is the burial of the Honorable William Kamoti, who was killed in a road traffic accident yesterday, and he had just been cleared by the IBC to defend his seat on an ODM ticket. Michael Mwadiga will be giving us that report. At the Bomas of Kenya, IBC presidential candidates are getting clearance, so we shall be keeping tabs on that story with Kamuche Medza. The Council of Governors is to give a statement on lost cancer drugs at the Kenyatta National Hospital. The chair of the Health Committee, Kisumu Governor Professor Anyang' Nyong'o, will address that. And later, within this hour, President Uhuru Kenyatta will receive the visiting president of the Republic of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, and his delegation at State House Nairobi. Nancy Okware is our reporter. So we get back to a conversation, and it is about anthropology, genetics, and sport. We're joined by the Director of Research and Innovation at Maseno University, Professor Collins Ouma, and a biomedical scientist, Gerald Luande, who is in Eldoret. And we've got the background of this study, a paper that they that was published collaborating with other scholars from around the world, Genetic Differentiation in African Ethnicities and its Relationship with Endurance Running Success. And Professor Ouma, let me come to you. And from the study, tell us about the findings that you picked up when it came to the matter of genetics, for example, amongst the Kalenjin of Kenya, the Oromo of Ethiopia, and say the Wolof, who are found in Senegal, or the Yoruba and Igbo of Nigeria.
Thank you, Daniel, once more. The study came up with very interesting findings, and just as I mentioned before, we had populations that do not have athletics being successful as control. So the initial results demonstrated that there were unique genes that were picked up from Kalenjin and Oromo populations, because we were now analyzing this at the population level and not really at the athletic level. So for the Kalenjin, we picked up 297 unique genes that were associated with endurance running. And then for the Oromo, we picked up 352 genes. But remember, when you are doing a genetic analysis, there's always a requirement that you have to control for several variables and interpopulational differences within those particular populations. So when we did that, we ended up with 10 now for the Kalenjin population in Kenya and 27 genes from the Oromo population. Now, just by identifying a gene doesn't help anything. So we want really to relate the genes that we had identified within these two different populations and whether they had some relationship with some functional parameters that could lead them to be relevant in endurance. So interestingly enough, we figured out that what Gerald just mentioned, that were contributory factors toward a successful athlete, were actually associated with some of these genes. For example, there are certain genes that were associated functional effect on anthropology and the biomechanical that I mentioned about. And then there were those which were actually touching lung function of those particular individuals. Now, there are others who are now blood pressure and the circulatory system, others touching metabolism, others touching on acid metabolism, and others touching on calcium homeostasis. Now, if you look at these parameters that I've mentioned physiologically, some of the parameters that are contributory toward the successful athlete particular population that we've been looking for. Now, I just want to be careful a little bit about what I'm talking about. That elite sporting performance is the result of interaction between genetic training factors, with the result that what
but clearly the gaps are opening up pretty quickly. One of the poles in that group early on, and 2:07 just striding along, and you have to face that awful truth.
Now, Gerald, let me come to you. And Gerald, what I want you to tell us is, from the study that you found and having worked with athletes at the highest level and all of this, Gerald, you could tell us, how then do you implement this in a place where you're working with athletes or a place that has potential for athletes?
Okay, so first of all, let's begin with the background. Ordinarily, in countries like the United States of America or countries within Europe, there have been companies selling genetic kits telling you we can test if your child can play basketball or be in NFL or those kind of sports. And that has been very controversial. However, that does not negate the fact that there's a genetic influence, because a genetic influence has worked for us.
We talked about the corners on this course, and a moment ago we saw the U-turn. So there's one full 180-degree U-turn, 7 corners in all. The corner coming up at 4 kilometers is a very sharp corner onto the beach. But personally, I set my 10 kpb on an undulating course, because if the hills aren't too steep, it doesn't slow you down too much going uphill, and then when you're going downhill, you can really put your foot down. So slight undulations.
All right. Looks like there's a slight freeze of your picture, Gerald, and we're speaking with Gerald Lwande, who is a biomedical scientist based in Eldoret. He has worked with athletes. He was the Kenyan lead for the Ineos 159 project, and also he worked in the Breaking 2 project, so we won't be talking about that, but he's talking about a study about genetic differentiation and how they eventually affect East African ethnicities and their relationship with endurance running success. And also, we have got Professor Collins Ouma. He is the Director of Research and Innovation at Maseno University, and he was the African Scientist of the Year for the year 2011 by the British Royal Society. And let us now go back to Gerald. And Gerald, you can continue with about the application of this study and also looking at, the anthropology of a place, and also looking at, the social and economic drivers that make one an elite runner.
Thank you very much, Wahome. As I was saying, the same way an athlete will need the basic medical and physiological tests that are done prior to training and competition, we now need to think about also doing a few genetic tests so that we direct an athlete where they fit. However, these genetic tests alone cannot be used as the marker of ability to perform well in that field. So you must do the genetic test and mix it with other physiological and sporting tests so that we don't throw coaches out of business. The other thing is we should have an enabling environment. So if you go to Iten where you see athletes waking up in the morning and training in large droves, we should have such kind of support system also in other regions of the country. Because that does not mean that if you're not Kalenjin, you cannot perform well in a marathon. We've seen athletes from Kamba ancestry, Meru, and even Kikuyu who have been able to perform very well. We all remember Samuel Wanjiru. So that does not necessarily mean that these genetic traits are domiciled among the Kalenjins. They can be seen also in other outliers in other communities. And for the sprinters, from the finding, we realized that there were the genes that augment the sprinting ability. And we've seen Omanyala, who is Luya, and our control group were actually Luyas.
Okay. And I want to come to Professor Ouma, and this is what I want to bring in now. What the study about are in sprints, because we know that from Western Kenya we have a history, we have great sprinters coming out from that. So what the study brought out, and even as you try to study those, got their roots in West Africa. Think of the Igbo, think of the Yoruba, or the Wolof in Senegal.
Yeah, what I wanted to say, Wahome, is that just as Gerald has said, the genetics are actually innate, and you need other parameters to augment and become a successful athlete in this process. And I want to emphasize that genetic predisposition does not mean predestination. Like if you have this particular genetic composition, then automatically you'll be elite. And vice versa. You might find populations that they could be harboring this particular genetic variance, but because they don't have other elements within the population, within their environment that can support the process so that they can sprint up and become successful athletes, then they can never become successful athletes. And I want to say that success in sports should not be taken as a regional or tribal or racial stereotype, so that we know that if we have a particular genetic, automatically this is the outcome that you'll expect. Because I must emphasize the genetics of such thing as successful athletics is quite complex, and to come to a particular conclusion is usually very difficult and quite complex. So given the fact that we are looking at different populations in Kenya, and then we are looking at several other populations across other Africa or other races, I just want to emphasize that genetic factors, as we have talked about, they may influence long distance running, but then environmental, socio-cultural, and other motivational factors should never be ignored. And I believe that even from other populations, as long as we have this cocktail of variables, then they can still become successful athletes.
There was quite a lot of debris, leaves and branches on the course, but that's all been cleared before today.
Your publication, there's some things that you've argued. You've made it very clear that one of the things that you would not want to do is reinforce population or racial stereotyping. How do you go around this to ensure that the work that you've done, it's set a foundation for more research, is protected and does not become something unethical? Professor, you could just hold on to that as briefly right now we move over and we get to catch up with the Kenya Kwanza Coalition, who are having a dialogue with Kenyans. Let us listen to this. So we can come back to you, Professor. How do you ring fence this kind of work such that the findings are not used to create, racial stereotyping or reinforcing population stereotyping? How does this work remain ethical?
Race about 3 weeks ago, but she dropped out of the World Championships 10,000 meters in Doha last year in October.
Position with Professor Collins Ouma and Gerald Wande, who are biomedical scientists, and the conversation is about anthropology, genetics, and also where we have got sports and the outcome of sports. Professor Ouma, was coming to you, and the question that I wanted to ask was, how do we ensure that this work is ethically protected so that it is not used for the wrong purposes, people using racial stereotyping or population stereotyping?
The athletes a stable income which allows them to focus on training. If your income is solely dependent on racing, then you're under pressure to get out there and perform. And of course this year it's been extremely difficult with the lack of competition. World Athletics did actually provide a financial hardship fund for athletes who were suffering financial difficulties to apply to. So the 5k split there, 15:20 for the first 5k.
This front pair, and they have been at the front since the gun, are tiny in stature, they really are.
Koska had a formidable year in 2017. I haven't quite seen the same form from her more recently, but she was second in Valencia 2 years ago in this race.
All right, so yes, it's a conversation that's about anthropology, genetics, and sports. And we are having Professor Collins Ouma, Director of Research and Innovation at Maseno University, and Gerald Wande, a biomedical scientist, as they give us information about this. Now, also, we're having a little bit of a technical issue with our Zoom link with Professor Ouma, who's in Maseno, and also Gerald, who's in Eldoret. We shall be having correcting